I'm delighted to be here today as a guest of the Danube Institute to talk about current affairs. I readily accepted this invitation because for some reason I've had a long interest in Hungary. I first came here with an Anglican minister, a friend I made in Cambridge, who said, would like to follow me for a drive through Central Europe. We took an Aeroflot flight, transited through Moscow, where he happily distributed Bibles, and I did not know him when I was there. We arrived in Budapest, picked up an Avis car, stayed in a kind of Airbnb apartment, and spent 4 happy days here. It's a long time ago, 1979, and I've only some vague memories, but strong impressions of Budapest, of Esztergom, of Lake Balaton. And I'm happy that Csaba from the Institute brought me to Esztergom and Visegrad on Saturday, and Yuli brought me to Lake Balaton for a swim yesterday. And of course, it was a different world, and it will continue to be a different world as we go forward. I'm always intrigued by the position Prime Minister Orban has taken. And he sticks out because he wants to preserve Hungary's identity. It's not easy for a relatively small population to preserve your identity. I mean, you're 10 million in Hungary, maybe 5 million outside Hungary, ballpark numbers. But to maintain your sense of yourself, translating books, maintaining a literature, it's not easy in an age of globalization. But the European peoples have always been able to do this. I've been advisor to IESE Business School in Barcelona for many years. And there is a Catalonian identity and a Catalonian spirit. When I was a trade minister, I signed our free trade agreement with the European Free Trade Association in Iceland. And they're a tiny population, but a very profound sense of itself and a refusal to melt into a larger reality. Of course, they're international, they're cosmopolitan, but they know they are the Icelandic people. So this is Europe, with its strong sense of separate evolutions, but part of a wider co-evolution of the European peoples, which created the European Union. China stands in great contrast. There's no such diversity in China. There are regional variations, obviously, in food, in customs, in accents, in social preferences. So divorce rates, crime rates for different things. I mean, you have an atlas of that in China, and there are regional differences. But by and large, in China, 92% of the people are Han people. And Han people have one literature. I mean, Europe has multiple literatures, but China has one literature. So at the two ends of the Eurasian landmass are two separate sets of social evolution over the centuries. And Hungary is probably the most Asian of the European peoples. So you put your family name first. Now the chopsticks people can understand this. In Japan, they also put their family name first. But after the Second World War, well, to accommodate the needs of globalization, they inverted. But among themselves, they have the family name first. And the Japanese PMO a few years ago said, no, even internationally, we should put our family name first. But in practice, it will take time. But here you put your family name first. Is this just convention? Or does it reflect something deeper? It must reflect something deeper. That somehow, in your identity, the group comes before the individual. Among tribal peoples, say the Arabs, they are moving all the time. So you can't identify people by family name because we all have the same family name. So you identify by yourself by who's your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather. Of course, there's a tribal name which comes at the end. So the Hungarian people have always fascinated me in their assertiveness of a separate identity. When I was in school, in my stamp collection, the biggest stamps came from Hungary, Magyar Posta. I don't know why, but it always fascinated me why a small country should want to have the biggest stamps of anybody else. There is a certain impulse. Your stamps have become smaller, but I don't think the underlying impulse have changed. So when I listened to Viktor Orban, I said, oh, there's something in the history of the people which speaks out through him now. Of course, even within Hungary, he's a controversial figure, but there is this strain, there's this streak in you. I talk about Hungary, I talk about Asia, because Europe will have a very big role in deciding the big issue of war and peace in the world. If Europe lightly takes American positions, and Americans feel that they have the support of the entire Western world except Russia, the chances of a clash with China may become more likely. Take the issue of Taiwan, which many European leaders jump onto without knowing the history, forgetting that the status of Taiwan was settled in the Cairo Declaration and confirmed in the Potsdam Proclamation, and therefore a status which was legally agreed to by all the major Victoria powers. And to lightly now say, well, the Taiwanese people should have a referendum, maybe they should consider being different. Yes, you must consider the views of local people. But you push that principle, well, what about Crimea? What about Catalonia? What about Scotland? Maybe one day Wales? Maybe the northern part of Serbia? The whole of Africa would dissolve into violence if you say referendums should decide political boundaries. So to say the issue of Taiwan is negotiable depends. Now for the Chinese, this is, they say, the core of all core interests, and already agreed to for a long time. But in recent years, for other reasons, being played lightly. They react neurologically. And the Americans know that if they resile from the one China position, then they are on a collision course. So Blinken, in his recent visit, affirmed to Xi Jinping, I think less than a day ago, or maybe a day ago, that no, we hold to that position. But in Europe, the knowledge of history has weakened. It has been an obsession with your own internal construction. The British, who used to understand distant parts of the empire intimately in order to divide and rule, they've lost that knowledge. When I was trade minister, I met a deputy minister from the UK, from Scotland, and I was shocked by how little he knew about Asia. When his forebears established, say, the underpinnings of Hong Kong, the Scottish legacy in Hong Kong, it's a profound legacy, but a younger generation would not know it. So this issue of Taiwan is dangerous because there is no deep understanding. And in the coming years, we have to anticipate a world where the Chinese GDP may equal that of the US and EU combined. It's not inconceivable. China's GDP per capita is 1/5 of the US today. If it reaches half that of the US, then its GDP would be that of the US and the EU combined, more or less. It's just arithmetic. Is it inconceivable that China's per capita GDP should reach half that of the US? But they're hardworking people. They have strong families. They're high savers. They study. They're obsessed with examinations. In classical music, there are tens of millions of Chinese students learning music in China. So it's entirely possible that the per capita GDP will reach half that of the US. If it becomes even more than half that of the US, then its economy will be that of the US, EU, and Japan combined. So we're talking about a phenomenon which is not small. Everyone will be affected. Every family, every company, whether for offensive reasons or defensive reasons. And if you are a company and you have a huge market developing, you study that market thoroughly, in detail. But if you watch how geopolitics is being managed today, about statements being made, policies being formulated about China, I look at some of these individuals and ask myself, how much do they understand China? And yet they're speaking as if China is reducible to a few stock phrases. It's an autocracy. Xi Jinping is abandoned what Deng Xiaoping advised China to do, reducing China to a few slogans, stock phrases, and thinking that on that basis you can make policy. You're bound to make big mistakes. So when I come to Hungary, being also from a small country, you have a suitably modest view about your own ability to change the world. And therefore, you have to understand the world so that you can act skillfully. So in Singapore, we know you can't change the world. You could accept the world for what it is. So we have close links to America. So we study America. We send people there. I think we understand America to some degree. We are ethnically 3/4 Chinese. And we know China is going to become more and more important to us. So we study China. And I hope European leaders will gradually deepen the understanding of China and take China seriously against its own history and civilization. I go back to the Jesuits when they went to China. I mean, when Francis Xavier told Ignatius, I will go convert China. The audacity of that decision. Of course, he failed. He didn't even reach the Chinese mainland. But when Matteo Ricci went there, he first dressed himself as a monk, thinking that the Chinese would respect monks the way Europeans respected monks. He found that the Chinese literati looked down on monks. They respected scholarship. Well, he was one of the most brilliant men Europe has ever produced, with an encyclopedic memory. So if they respect scholars, he was a scholar. He dressed as a scholar. He studied Chinese. He mastered the Chinese classics. And he knew that he could only evangelize by getting into their minds, understanding their philosophy. Translating Deus into Chinese was a difficult task. Francis Xavier took the name, which turned out to be the name of a minor Japanese deity. It didn't get him anywhere. Matteo Ricci, realizing that the Chinese have an a-religious tradition, but accepted that there was one heaven, which they call Tian, one heaven, monotheistic, that the emperor was the emperor of all of heaven, that all reality is below heaven, and that if you as ruler loses the mandate of heaven, then it is morally justifiable to overthrow you. You have lost 天命, the mandate. So God, he finally translated as the Lord of Heaven, 天主. And till today, the Chinese translation for the Roman Catholic Church is 天主教, the religion of the Lord of Heaven. The Jesuits had to do this because they only had their mouths. They didn't have boats and gunboats. When they produced the catechism books, Jesus and Mary and the apostles were all Chinese. How could they not be if you want to persuade the Chinese that you have a superior set of beliefs? But in the 19th century, when European missionaries had the support of guns and gunboats, Jesus and Mary became European. They had blue eyes. And Chinese revolutionaries knew that if your gods are foreign gods, then their domination of you is complete. The way Cortez was able to subjugate the Aztecs because the Aztecs believed that a white god would come to redeem them. You see? So when Xi Jinping said Christianity has to be sinicized, the reaction in the West is, there you are, there you go again. And this autocrat wanting to sully the Christian inheritance. But this Pope thinks differently. He has a mission to reconcile with China. For 7 years, I was helping him in the Vatican on administrative reform because he wanted the Chinese. And I had lost the elections. And someone told one of the cardinals that I was available. And so I got roped in. I only found out a few years later how I was recruited into this exercise. When he went to Guadalupe and meditated on the image of Our Lady has had hundreds of apparitions around the world. But in only one did she leave her image, which was in Guadalupe. And it was of her self as a mestiza. So this was the Pope's meditation, that God appears to us not as an abstraction, but in our deepest identity. When he went to visit the Rohingyas in the refugee camp in Bangladesh, he told them, God is Rohingya, not just to comfort them, but something he believes in. When I address mainland alumni of Peking University, I say, God is Chinese. God has to be Chinese if Christianity is to have any impact in China. God is Hungarian. How can he not be? So human identity is not something to be lightly waved away as if it is shallow programming. Identity is what makes us civilized. It's what makes us spiritual. Because each of us is created uniquely. The European Union was established on the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, which means nothing should be taken from the individual to harm him. The properties of a parish belong to the parish under canon law. The bishop cannot commandeer the properties of a parish. He can tax the parish. He cannot expropriate the parish. So at every level, power can only be taken away to benefit the individual or the group from which it is taken away. But over the years, the European Union has grown, it's become highly politicized in its attitudes. So when I see little Hungary asserting its own difference, wanting to preserve its own identity, there's a flutter in my heart. Because I also come from a small country where we treasure our own autonomy and identity. And maybe this is a great struggle in the world today. You have an identity, and you have larger groupings which want to take that away for reasons of efficiency, because it's so much more convenient to have one language, one internet, one ChatGPT. But we know at the same time that you have one common language, one internet, one ChatGPT, in the end you lose your identity. Li Kai-fu, who wrote this book, The Superpower Contest in AI Between the US and China, we were at a meeting in Venice recently. He said, in Muslim countries, they worry about ChatGPT. You say, draw an image of Muhammad. You produce many images of Muhammad. His argument is ChatGPT is value-laden. And right now, it's been trained on mostly the English language. They say that after a few more years, ChatGPT will gobble up information all over the world. I'm not so sure, because in China, they will have a separate universe. In Europe, whether you can or not, I do not know, but you certainly have a wish to have a separate universe. So there is a tension between autonomy, your free will, and the needs of a larger polity. And this is a great struggle in the world today. And maybe in that struggle, Hungary and Singapore find common cause. Maybe I end here and we have our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for that, George. That was tremendous. So in order to respond to your very intriguing remarks on the relationship between Hungary, Singapore, and the role of small nations, which I think is really intriguing, we're going to have two commentaries. Firstly, Choba Horvath is going to say a few things. And then Victor. So, Choba, do you want to?
Is it on? Okay, it's on. So right now we can see two important diplomatic visits. One of Antony Blinken to China, and the other by Narendra Modi to the US. And I would like to ask you about these, the implications and significance. And
I think many of us followed closely Blinken's visit. He had many hours of conversation with the Chinese Foreign Minister, Qin, with the Chinese State Councillor for Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi, and then he called on Xi Jinping. Both sides described the talks as candid and constructive, and that high-level channels of communication should be kept open. Blinken gave a press conference after that. He said it was a robust exchange, but the general tone was a slight lowering of temperature in the bilateral relations between the US and China. I think in the short term, relations will not get worse. It's partly because of coming presidential elections in the US and worries about the economy. You remember in 2008, when we had a global financial crisis, the G7 was not able to generate sufficient global demand. George Bush convened the first G20 summit. In the following year, in 2009, Gordon Brown in London got the countries together to pump prime. And China pulled its weight. China weighed in. And in 3 years, China poured more concrete than the US in its entire history. It created big distortions in the Chinese economy, and they had no gratitude for it. If the world goes into another financial crisis because of the huge liquidity overhang resulting from COVID, there's no G20 now because the Western countries won't sit with Russia on the same table. And China will be more circumspect. So our ability to recover from a lack of demand in a new financial crisis will be greatly reduced. And I think that's one reason why the US wants communications with China, particularly Yellen, the Treasury, because they worry. In the presidential year, if the economy is mismanaged, Trump will come back. And in the US now, anything they can do to remove Trump, they would do. So there's a big domestic fight in the US, which explains part of the reason why they want better communication with China. The other reason is, of course, the Ukraine war. Right now, all sides are giving war a chance, a final chance. But I think in 6 months, in a year and a half, there'll be a strong push towards having a ceasefire. And China will have to play some kind of a role. So I think these are the two main reasons why relations between the US and China in the short term will improve. Modi's visit to China, of course, the US would want India to weigh in on its side against China. But India is too old a civilization to have too great a sense of itself to be made use of anybody. I tell my American friends, you think you make use of India? Well, India will make use of you too. And on the Ukraine war, despite US pressure, India maintains its own position. So if the US can add pressure on China to help India in its border talks with China, that's helpful. But if it's against Indian interests, India will act separately. But for the time being, it behooves India to sit on every table and to improve relations with the US. This year, the BRICS, the G20 meeting will be in India. I know the two sides are talking. There could be a breakthrough. Modi made a gesture of friendship in Bali, but it was just a gesture. Whether they can find enough agreement on the border to restore bilateral relations, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you want to follow that up? That's all. Do you want to ask anything further? No? Okay. Victor?
Should I ask or make a short comment?
Make a short comment.
Yeah. When I had the request to participate in discussion on the Indo-Pacific, I had to sit down and think it over. What does it mean Indo-Pacific for me? And I have to admit that in the last decade, there were only two major geopolitical concepts which became extremely popular. One was the Indo-Pacific, but the other was the Belt and Road Initiative. And I used to teach geopolitics, and it came to my mind that, oh, well, is it really new? Okay, currently we are talking about this. There are a lot of events like today on this issue, but are they really new? Or this is the same as we used to talk about the continental powers versus the maritime powers. And when we think about Mackinder, the axis of Russia and China, or the so-called sea power coalition led by the United States, has a kind of a resonance of this kind of concepts. So it came to my mind for me that what are these concepts are about? Is it about the global leadership? So who is going to lead the international system? The international system is in many ways seems to be sick. And if I understand well, the claim of the Indo-Pacific strategy is to maintain the rules-based international order, the open Indo-Pacific. But this necessarily means to keep the power position of the United States and maintain those alliances on the top of the hierarchy. And then it comes to my mind that what could be the role of Europe in this kind of power contest? So I very would like to ask George's opinion on how do you see what could be the role of Europe in this power context and within this framework. Do you agree with this framework that this is about hierarchy and who is leading the international order? And what could be the place of Europe in this regard? And if you already mentioned the small country perspective, what a small country like Hungary should think about the Indo-Pacific, and do we really need to figure out a strategy to deal with this changing environment?
Whether we are talking about the Indo-Pacific or Quad or AUKUS, the elephant in the room is China. And sometimes China is not even mentioned in the communique, but everybody knows that the communique is about China. Why is China such a challenge to everybody? It's because of its size and homogeneity. Why are the Chinese people so homogeneous? Historically, Chinese civilization has organized more human beings than any other human group. Why is the case? Well, my belief is because of paper. One important reason is paper. For centuries, China had a monopoly of paper. With paper, you can record more bits and bytes than on parchment, on leather, on papyrus, on stone tablets. So for centuries, China had a level of information, had a level of data intensity in the way it was organized, which nobody else had. So the programmers were the scholars. Their whole life was spent on mastering the language and on writing. So brush on paper gives you orders of magnitude in terms of information storage and processing than any other form of writing material. And China had that as a monopoly for centuries. Finally, in the 8th century, in the battle in Central Asia, the Abbasids captured Chinese prisoners of war who knew how to make paper. And so in Samarkand, in Pokhara, in Damascus, Baghdad, they had paper mills. And from then on, Islamic civilization went through a huge transformation. They produced scholars, they had mathematics. By the year 1000, it reached Cairo. By the year 1002, it reached Muslim Spain. And the Muslims in turn wanted to keep it a monopoly and not let the Europeans know how to make paper. But it reached out to northern Italy. And there the Renaissance began. I was in Montserrat a month ago. For centuries, the Benedictines, the monks, maintained the coding of European civilization, painfully on parchment. The Swiss tell me that because the monasteries were most intact in Switzerland, some of the most important records were in the Benedictine monasteries in Switzerland, like St. Gallen. But once you had paper and printing, everything changed. So the Chinese have always depended on information and data to organize people. Now, Alan Turing had this insight that if you have an unlimited amount of paper, you can do an unlimited amount of algorithmic computation given enough time. And the more computation you can do, the more people you can organize. Then you see human society as a computational system. See? So that's the reason why China is so big. It has a culture, it created examinations, it created a meritocratic civil service, which the Jesuits informed Europe about, which created civil services in Europe, particularly the French. And when you think about that, it is because China is so big that every time it rises, it's a challenge to everybody. But will it be aggressive? I don't think it will be aggressive, because it has a deep instinct to preserve its own homogeneity. So China has always built walls around itself. It has walls, physical walls, it has walls for culture, for biological tissues, for Hollywood movies, for capital markets. And during COVID, it has the most impressive wall of all, the biological wall of China. So this is the instinct of China, that every time there's a crisis, it shuts the gates, because it has a huge internal universe and really a self-sufficient internal economy. So the elephant in the room in all these conversations is China, and how to accommodate, accept a China that threatens Western dominance, which Westerners have taken for granted for 200 years, and now saying, oh, we may lose it. and the Americans who see themselves dominant in all fields, worrying that they may lose it.
That's, I suppose the other thing that comes out of that, George, is does this mean that we're in a clash of civilizations format now? That if the international order as an institutional rules-based order is fading away, that we're now facing what Huntington called a clash of civilizations in 1997, becoming more a feature of what becomes a multipolar world, that you've got a very clear Chinese sense of a civilization, you've got a Russian sense of its own civilization, you've got an India with a sense of its own civilization, and a West that's kind of undermining its own civilization through wokeness. Do you think this is the paradigm for the world going forward?
The danger in the West is you see China in your own image against your own template. So all this theorizing over the Thucydidean trap and the Peloponnesian War, that somehow China fits into a European paradigm. Of course, there's an equivalent danger on the other side, that China sees others in its own image. But it's a much smaller danger than Europeans seeing China in its own image. If China were like the Soviet Union, evangelical, expansionary, then yes, the clash is inevitable. But that's not China's nature. Their instinct is, when there's a crisis, shut the gates, keep out the foreigners, keep Chinese in. That's always been their instinct. It is not the Russian instinct. The Russian instinct is, when I'm threatened, I expand. The more I'm threatened, the more I have to expand. The Chinese instinct is, the more I'm threatened, the more I hunker down and block out foreigners. So for decades under Mao Zedong, when they were finding their own self, they just kept out foreigners. I know this personally because my mother came from China. My parents were married in China in 1937. A month later, the Japanese invaded, they rushed back. She left China as a young bride of 19. She could not go back to 1978. So during those decades, China turned inwards. That is the nature of Chinese society. So with China, with Russia, I'm not enough of an expert. I think there will be a clash. But with China, there's no necessary clash.
So in terms of the evolving world picture, and particularly in geoeconomic terms, as you said, the West seems to be facing an ongoing huge inflationary monetary problem. There's not that problem in China or in Southeast Asia, it seems. Why is that? How effectively? I was just looking at GDP figures for Singapore recently. Like the Singaporean economy is growing at about 3%, I think, per annum. Its interest rates are something like 4%, and its inflation is below 6%, about 5%. If any European or the Western economy had those kinds of figures, people would be jumping for joy, I think. How's Singapore done that? And I think the picture in China and Asia generally is not as bad as it is in Europe.
This year, ASEAN's trade with China will reach $1 trillion. It is significantly bigger than China's trade with the US, than China's trade with Europe, than Europe's trade with America. And in the coming years, the economies of Southeast Asia and China will grow together. And that's one reason why we are doing relatively well. May I make this point? because it may surprise you, that China was the least damaged economy during COVID. China was the last country to open up, which is the best strategy in an epidemic. China had the fewest number of deaths per million than any other major country. In 2020, while the rest of us were at home behind our screens, and then ordering from Amazon or whatever, and then looking forward to the parcels which are delivered through our doors. Who made the things in the parcels? They're all made in China. So for 3 years, China's factories produced for the entire world. In 2020, China's trade surplus, merchandise trade surplus, was $510 billion. In 2021, it became $670 billion US. In 2022, when you had the Shanghai lockdown and people said that China was really in horror and confusion, China's trade surplus went up to $870 billion. China did not have to print money, unlike Europe or America or Japan. And that's why today, while interest rates are trending up everywhere, in China, interest rates are trending down. This gives the Chinese government enormous policy flexibility. And if China does well, Hong Kong will do well, Singapore will do well.